Hi everyone, my name is Steph, this is the Novelty Corner and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a discussion video and this was a discussion topic that was suggested to me by Heather from Here Booktubes. And I've kind of procrastinated filming it, but I really need to film it before I go back to work because a lot of the books I'm talking about are books that are going to be shuffled around and stored or taken into work or things like that. And the question that Heather posed to me for a discussion topic was, does middle grade have a page length issue? Hence the title. And I think it's really easy to have a knee-jerk reaction to say, yes, it does, because middle grade books can be quite long. And initially that was my reaction when we were talking about the question. I'm like, well, yeah, it kind of does. But I think the answer is far more complex than that. And that's sort of where this discussion video is coming from. But I will also admit to not feeling 100% confident in talking on this issue. I am not a publisher, a bookseller, or a librarian. I am a teacher, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but there is a difference between teachers talking about books and people who actively work in the book industry talking about books. I'm also a reader, and so that is another hat that I wear when I come to this discussion. And I read middle fiction and I enjoy it. But there's a few nuanced things that I probably want to talk about in this video. So I don't know how coherent this is going to be. It's going to be a bunch of thoughts. I have been listing out things and I've been listing them out, procrastinating, actually just sitting down and talking about it. So bear with me, and at any point, feel free to jump in the comments with your own thoughts on the topic. Before we start anything, I actually want to define what middle grade is. So that's defining a readership. And this is something that really bothers me when people talk about books online, because they tend to talk about things like middle grade and young adult as genres. They're not genres, they're a readership category. And we have multiple readership age categories, and they vary slightly depending on where you are in the world, and some publishers pad out the age groups and so on and so forth, particularly in children's literature. So this is also something that can be really tricky for people. So when we're talking about middle fiction, we are typically talking about readers who are between 8 and 12 years old. Now, the caveat to that is sometimes that gets stretched out from 8 to 14 years old, and there is an issue with that, which I'll talk about in a moment. Junior fiction is sort of the step below that. So that tends to be 5 to 8-year-olds or 5 to 9-year-olds. Then you have young adult, which can be anything from 12 to 14 to 18 years old. Young adult has its own issues, which I'm not going to go into in this video, but I think some of the points that I make later about middle grade books will also be very applicable to young adult titles. And then after that, you have the adult readership. New adult has been up in the air for a long time, but it's really not a thing. It really goes from young adult to adult. And then prior to all of that, you have children's picture books. But children's picture books are an interesting case because you tend to have picture books for very, very young children, so 0 to 3 years old. Then you sort of have the 3 to 5 category. Then you have your middle grade picture books, and there are also some picture books that are for much older readers. So there is a scope, and we're not talking about picture books in here because that gets very complicated. As I said, some of the readership age categories can go up or down depending on who you talk to. I am going to think roughly in terms of 8 to 12, 8 to 14 years of age. Another thing that I really want to highlight is that a lot of adults read middle fiction, and that is amazing because kids literature is phenomenal. There is so much amazing work happening in this space. The thing that I think frustrates me a little bit in the online space when adults are talking about middle fiction is that there is not a lot of discussion that people have around the fact that we as adults are not the intended audience of children's literature. Middle fiction is not written for us. We can absolutely enjoy it. We can absolutely have fun with it. But I think often when people talk about it, they're centering themselves as the reader. And that's totally fine if that's all they're doing. They're just reading it for themselves or they don't have kids in their lives. But we have to remember that particularly when critiquing children's literature, we are not the intended audience. The intended audience are those kids who are between 8 to 12 or 8 to 14 years of age. And there is a reason why things may not work for adults in middle fiction, but will work for kids. And we just have to be wary of that. So that's not a criticism of anyone who's reviewing books, but I suppose if you don't have kids or you don't work with kids, it can kind of be easy to forget that, particularly if you are reading them for enjoyment because you have a passion for middle fiction. Essentially, all I'm saying is we just need to keep that in mind as we're reading them. The other thing that I think affects readership is that there is a bit of a difference between a child independently reading a text, like the intended audience reading a middle fiction text, and the intended audience being read the text by an adult. This can affect the suitability of books for kids in a really positive way. It might make a book that might have previously been inaccessible to a child because they're not ready to read it independently yet more accessible because there's an adult there helping them with it. It's a great thing, but also something to keep in mind as we're going through the discussion points. So let's talk about book length for a moment. So I actually went through probably the last 30 middle grade or middle fiction titles that I've read. I have a stack of books that are in storage and I didn't have time to go and grab them out and it's a whole thing. I went and grabbed sort of the last 30 that I have that haven't been put away yet and compared how long these titles are just to see sort of what I was getting. And I was going to have an under 100 pages, an under 200 pages, under 300 pages, and sort of 400 plus pages. And of the books that I was able to pull together, not a single book was under 100 pages long. The closest I got to less than 100 pages is Sea Glass by Rebecca Fraser. This one is just over 100 pages, so I suppose we could technically count it. It's a very small novel. It is a middle fiction title. It is probably more geared to that 8 to 12 age category, and it is a contemporary fiction story. It is truly delightful. But this was the closest I got to a very short middle fiction title. So this was my under 200 pages stack. These 5 books out of 30 were under 200 pages long. This was my stack that was under 300 pages long. So these range from about 220 pages to under 300. I have to put them down because I'm going to drop them, but there are 17 of those titles, which I think is fairly standard. A 200 to 300 page book is kind of standard anywhere, right? And these are sort of my 300 plus book titles. So we have everything from about 350 pages all the way to 500 plus pages. So these are very, very chunky middle fiction titles. I also have 2 more that I'm talking about in a moment. I didn't include them in the stack, so that's why the numbers don't add up. But also in those book stacks, I have everything from a traditional novel to poetry anthologies to novels told in verse to graphic novels. So there's a range in there. But I think as I was starting to think about this discussion on length, I think it really came back to sort of this misconception or this sort of community held idea that reading longer books makes you a better reader. And I think this is something that we hear adults talking about more often. I think that translates to kids. So you often hear people talking about reading the longest books on their shelf, like it's a badge of honor. And 100% go for it. Read the longest books you want to read. That's not a criticism of people. But when you put that up on a pedestal as being the best thing that you can do, that you're going to read, either like if it's a ginormous chunky fantasy book or a really long historical fiction tome or lit fic or whatever, when you hear adults talking in that way and referring to that, being like a status symbol, that filters down to kids and they think that they have to be able to read really long books, when the reality is I think there are probably a lot of really long middle fiction titles that don't appeal to a lot of kids because they're not interested in those genres. I'm generalizing here in a huge way, but I think a lot of longer middle fiction titles tend to be fantasy and they tend to be historical, and not every kid wants to read those 2 genres, despite what everyone seems to think. The other thing that I think perpetuates this idea of the length of the book matters is when adults are criticizing other adults for reading kids lit and saying that doesn't count. If you're reading picture books, it doesn't count. You're reading middle fiction, that doesn't count. All that's doing is perpetuating harmful ideas. The other time that it really bothers me is when I hear adults complaining that their kids are only reading graphic novels or comics because they're perceived to be shorter and easier and not as complex. That also causes an issue. If I slip my teacher hat on, every now and then you'll have a conversation with someone about their child's reading. It could be about the comics issue, but it could be, we want them to read longer books. Okay, well, that's nice. You want them to read a longer book, but do they actually want to do it? Are they actually interested in it? And not only are they interested in it, is it something they're capable of at this point in time? Because it's okay for the answer for that to be no, because just because your child isn't reading a 300 plus book doesn't mean that they're not a good reader. I think we conflate the idea of longer books making better readers as opposed to what actually makes a really good reader, which then kind of leads me into a couple of points from the perspective of a teacher. Part of the problem with middle grade is the age range that it encapsulates. It encapsulates 8 to 12 or 8 to 14. Now that's 5 or 7 years of a child's life. The reading age difference between an 8-year-old and a 14-year-old is incredibly different. If you start tacking on reading challenges for individual children, that gap widens. Significantly so. So for example, I'm going into a year 2 class. In that class, I can expect reading ages of pre-foundation or pre-kindergarten all the way up to students reading at a year 4 or year 5 level. That is a huge range. And that gap only widens every year a child goes up through school. And the reason that that's important to think about is because middle fiction includes themes that you wouldn't necessarily see in a younger age category. And if you've got students who are reading at a higher level moving into middle fiction, you've got to be aware of sort of the themes that are going on in there. Same thing with middle fiction readers. Some of them need books that are definitely targeted at that 8, 9, 10-year-old range. Some of them need books that are more complex, but they may not necessarily actually be there with the themes yet. And that can be really tricky to manage for authors, publishers, etc. But the baseline is the reading difference between an 8 to a 12 or a 14-year-old is massive. And when you are trying to fit all of the books into that category, it becomes really tricky because then publishers have to market things in a particular way, because then we are relying on publishers to accurately tell us sort of where the book sits, or we're relying on reviewers to tell us where it sits. And most importantly, like if you have absolutely no idea, you need to talk to librarians and you need to talk to booksellers, because that's their job, is to know how to recommend these books for the right child. And this becomes really tricky for the layperson who is trying to actually choose a book for their child, or for a child that they know who fits into that category. They have to know a lot about it, because reading is not just reading the words on the page. You can have a young child who can read every single word on the page and could probably pick up one of these 200, 300 page books and read every single word on the page. It doesn't mean they actually understand what they're reading. They might, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. And so often, in order to be able to match kids with a good fit book, you need to know a lot about them. You need to know, can they actually read the words on the page? Do they actually understand what's going on? What's their comprehension like? Can they actually maintain the stamina to read a longer text? Can they actually hold that story in their head for the length of time? And then on top of that, something that is incredibly important, and this circles back to that I want my child to read longer books. Are they even interested in it? If they're not even interested in it, they're not going to even want to pick up the book. So that is a really significant point to be thinking about. And I think while there are plenty of options, there are so many fantastic middle grade options. Like, this is not, as I said at the start of this video, this is not a complaint about the actual readership category and the books that are out there. There are amazing books out there for middle grade readers, and there are books there for kids of all abilities. But what we have to match up is their reading ability and their interest level, and that can be really tricky at times. And I suppose the example, and I'm really annoyed because I've packed these books away, but Amari and the Night Brothers is a book that I absolutely love reading. It's a fantastic middle fiction fantasy story, but it is a long book. And I have recommended this to students at my school. I've recommended it to quite a few of them, but they all tend to be in year 5 or year 6. So even though middle grade can start from 8 years old, I'm very conscious of who I recommend the book to. And it has to be someone who is capable of managing that kind of longer text, that has the interest in it. And so I'm constantly thinking about that. So I wouldn't just recommend it to anyone. If someone said, oh yes, my child likes middle fantasy, I'm like, okay, well, here are some options, but you actually need to spend a bit of time thinking about them, because every book has a target audience. And just because middle fiction has an age range, it doesn't mean every book is written for everyone in that age category. You would kind of hope that that would be the case, but it's not necessarily. Some examples of that. So I've talked a lot about Ando's books. He writes serial books. They're a lot like the Animorphs series, which is the middle fiction series that I read when I was sort of that age, in that these are stories that are interconnected. They leave off on cliffhangers. They build into the next one. These ones have lots of pictures in them. They are a decent length, but the actual size of the text and the space between the words on the page are fairly big, which means that it doesn't have quite the same amount of text as a book that you would normally expect this length to be. And this one is probably targeted at the 8 to 11-year-old market. Whereas something like The Lorikeet Tree by Paul Jennings, I wouldn't necessarily give to an 8-year-old. Like, it might actually be slightly smaller, but this one is very deliberately geared to an older middle grade audience, to a young adult audience, but it still fits within that 8 to 14 category. But like, you need to know the difference. I mean, the really cool thing about this is that at least you can tell with this illustrated cover that this is probably geared for a younger audience, and this one is not necessarily going to appeal to an 8-year-old because it doesn't give much away. But I can say that as someone who spends a lot of time with books, so I think about these things. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone understands how that works. You might instinctively do it, but you may not necessarily know why you do it. And I suppose the other thing to note is that it seems to be that a lot of contemporary middle grade fiction tends to be shorter than fantasy or historical middle grade fiction, just as a general trend. As I said, I'm generalizing in a huge way here. So the contemporary stories, the more real life stories, tend to be a little bit shorter. Not all the time, but probably you don't get as many 500 plus contemporary fiction, middle fiction stories than you do fantasy stories. We know that fantasy requires a lot of world building, a lot of extra information, which can also impact a reader because they have to be able to hold that information for the length of the book. I really can't get away without talking about series in this video, because there's a very interesting trend with a series. And there is a very popular series that I will not talk about because of the author, but we all know it. And we all know that the books in that series started out as very quintessentially middle grade fantasy. And they were probably still 300-ish pages long when they first started. But as the series progressed, the books got longer and longer and longer. And that's because as they were being written and published, the audience of those books were getting older, because traditionally published books, it takes about a year for a new book to come out. going through all of that process, right? So the audience is getting older, so you have to write to that audience, which is fine. The problem that you then have though is that afterwards, after that series is complete, anyone new who's coming to that series, so maybe it's an 8 or 9-year-old who loves a middle grade fantasy book, they're not waiting a year between each book. They have access to every single book immediately because the series is complete. So they're actually starting to read books that are increasing in length each time that they read it, regardless of whether or not they're actually ready for it, because they suddenly have access to it. And the same can be said of a series like Skullduggery Pleasant, which is one of my favourite middle fiction fantasy series. And that sort of starts out at nearly 400 pages in the first book, and then it tops out at about 650 pages somewhere in the middle of the series. That is an incredibly long book series. And that's similar because it was traditionally published, it was being written and it was being released. The characters were getting older, the audience was getting older, so the books and the themes and the content got older and the page length got longer because of the stories that were being told. Again, not a criticism, just something interesting that happened with that series. And that's fine. I just think that when we are talking about how middle fiction readers are coming to those series now, those completed series, we just need to be mindful of knowing that they're going to come up to those next books really quickly because that can impact their reading. So as I said at the start, I don't think it's necessarily a page count issue. I actually think it's a content issue, and it's an understanding and an awareness of what middle fiction is, which books are written for which parts of the middle grade audience. And the reality is the layperson or the person who doesn't necessarily work in the field of children's literature is not necessarily going to know that. You need to make use of the professionals in the field. In this case, librarians and booksellers are going to be your best bet. Teachers may be able to help out with that, but the reality is for teachers, it's not their job to know the ins and outs of every middle fiction book if they're teaching that age category. They will usually have a small repertoire of books they know really, really well. And the fact that they don't necessarily branch out beyond that is because of timing. Their job requires a lot of moving parts. As teachers, we also have to very specifically choose books to teach reading, which is very different from kids choosing books to read for interest. And it's not that we don't take interest into account, but we're looking at very specific texts for very specific reasons. While we do have reading for enjoyment, if we're actually teaching with a book, we have a purpose for using it. So you will have teachers who are very knowledgeable, and you'll also have teachers who have a limited knowledge. And that's why teacher librarians are so important. And it's so disappointing, particularly over here in Australia, that we don't have more of them in schools. It's not a requirement, but you do have people who are very passionate about children's literature in schools, which is fantastic. And then I suppose the last thing that I wanted to mention, and this is me wearing my teacher hat again, when you're encouraging kids to read books, doesn't matter what age group that they're in, you're always going to have those really capable, very confident readers. They're going to read everything in sight. They're the voracious readers. They're going to pick up everything. They love the big books because to them that's what they want to do. Then you have the kids who are good readers, but who are intimidated by the size of a book or by the fact that they don't necessarily understand everything yet, or they can't read every single word. And so when that happens, they get really stumped. My one suggestion for that is either read with them. So if they want to read the big, long fantasy book, I mean, this is the most recent one. I will admit, I always get nervous when these books turn up for me to review because they're really long. And even myself as an adult, this is a middle grade fantasy book. I can read it really quickly. It might be long, but I can read it quickly as an adult. But I still get nervous anytime I see a big book because I have to be in the mood for a big book. But some kids really want to read them, but this intimidates them. The way to get over that for them is to either read it with them or get them the audiobook and the physical book and let them sit there and listen to it and read it along with the audio narration, because it can really help their confidence. But at the end of the day, if a kid doesn't want to read a really long middle fiction story, we shouldn't be pressuring them to do it. This does not have to be the ideal. The ideal can be what is of interest to each middle grade reader. And at the end of the day, we should just be encouraging what these kids want to read, whether it's a long book, a short book, a graphic novel, if it's an audio book. Because I forgot to say this earlier, when we make this the ideal, we're also being ableist in assuming that everyone can read this. And we need to move away from that because obviously that can be really harmful. And I think there is such a wide variety of books out there, and I think we have to value kids in what they would like to be able to choose to read. And then when they're ready for us to help them move to other things, because, kids get stuck in series and they get stuck in their favorite authors, just like we as adults get stuck in our favorite things. When they're ready to be open to suggestions, that's when we can help them move beyond that. But it needs to be at their pace because they're still learning to read. That's a simple fact. They're still learning to read, and we need to give them the time and space to do that. And if this is their preference over this, we accept it, because it is really difficult to write a really good short story and have it be impactful and interesting and engaging in a minimal word count. Just like it's incredibly difficult to world build and build up a 500-page book. Like, there is value in both. They're just different. So as I said, I don't know how coherent this video is going to be. If you stuck around, thank you very much. Feel free to have a chat in the comments. I'm more than happy for people to talk to me about any of these points. And as I said, none of this is a criticism of anyone or anything. I think it can be a really challenging thing to find the right book for the right child. It's always been a really complex thing to do. We can't know it all, and we're not expected to know it all. If you just want to let me know that you're here but you don't want to leave a comment, feel free to leave a book stack emoji down below. Otherwise, I hope that wherever you're in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I will see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.